things that I was most drawn to my new house was its location. Because I used to live on a really busy street, one that even though the posted speed limit sign is 25 miles per hour, that was hardly ever followed. It certainly wasn't what one would call the holy highway. It was more like the Autobahn, and we would sometimes, there have been people just stand out there yelling at cars to slow down. And all the trees that were on that road, if there were any, were more planted there as traffic calming devices. So my new house is in the exact opposite location. If you don't own a GPS, you may need a personal guide to actually get you to the house. I sort of joke that I live in the middle of nowhere, which is not true, but compared to where I used to live, it seems that way. The road that I live on now is bumpy, and it's hilly, and it's curvy, and the only speeding that happens on that road is when my kids are on their scooters racing down the hill at the end of the cul-de-sac. So this road, since I joke that it's in the middle of nowhere, is sort of nestled in a woods. And my house is or was surrounded by lush trees and chirping birds and kind of the silence that I didn't know before. Well, let me tell you today that those lush, thick trees, they hold a lot of leaves, which I didn't quite realize when I bought the house. So I'm no longer surrounded by this lushness that I once knew. Autumn has quickly given way to winter. So now when I look out my back window or I drive up upon the front porch, I see naked trees. I see emptiness. Their kind of skeletal being screams desolation rather than serenity now. It doesn't really maybe look like a desert like Isaiah talks about, but it definitely looks barren and dead. So last Sunday, friends from my old neighborhood came by to catch up. So all the kids went outside to play, and my friend and I stayed inside where it was warm. And we sort of marveled at how the kids were out there. I really do live in the forest. We're out there in the forest, running around with their Nerf guns, just all over the place. And as I looked out at them, dashing through this now very sparse woods, I noticed something else, something that I hadn't really taken notice of before. There in the middle of the forest was a path. When the earth was brimming with life, when there were actually flowers sprouting up all around, and there's also a little creek, when there was actually water in the creek, I hadn't taken notice of that before, that path there. And this path sort of led from the pruned, kind of domesticated part of my yard, up through the wilderness, to this clearing on the other side. That path, I didn't put it there. Somebody or something, an animal, someone put that path there. But it wasn't something I made. But right there in the middle of desolation was a path. A path to someplace else. And this is exactly what Isaiah points us to today. That there is a way through the wilderness. But that way is not one that we can fashion. The holy highway is not one we can pave, no matter how often we may think we can. But as people today, we often are very good at forging our own paths. We are certain that if we do the right things, if we eat the right foods, if we take care of ourselves, if we plan for the future, as people who do all these things, who try to secure a way for ourselves. We can kind of be left questioning the ways of God when something sort of blows us off course. Because then we begin to wonder, will we ever be able to get back on track? And does God really actually provide a secure path? Because you know as well as I do that it's really hard to sit with a friend when they say, I just don't know what I'm going to do or how I'm ever going to make it through. Because what do we say to that? Because there are lots of times when people say those things to me that I don't have a clue either. Because life can be like that. It can be like a desert. When life or love or hope or joy, when those things seem to tragically dry up, God seems very, very far away. And it's times like those I can't possibly survive, let alone get to the other side, get to the clearing moments, that I'm really, really thankful that God does indeed come with a vengeance to cut a path where there was no path, at least like a path that we can't see. The Bible, it speaks about a lot of different ways. It speaks about, we hear in Matthew today, we hear that John the Baptist was the one that came to prepare the way for Jesus. And we hear in the Gospel of John, we hear Jesus talked about as the way, the truth, and the life. But that's not what's going on here in Isaiah. In Isaiah, the way is for us to travel on. The path that Isaiah is talking about is the way that the redeemed people, the chosen, the loved, the promised people of God, this is the place that they travel on. We've been, throughout Advent, reading all through Isaiah. And on the very first Sunday in Advent, in Isaiah, it talks about these plowshares, or these swords being hammered into plowshares. And what I sort of envision with this God of determination, that God has that plowshare in hand, whacking through the wilderness, cutting and tossing aside all those things that would separate us from God. And the thing is that God doesn't just promise to clear a path. God's promise in clearing the path is to infuse joy into the sadness. It's the promise to turn weeping into laughter. And those are all things that we want. That joy and that laughter and that singing. That, to me, that sounds like the other side of the wilderness. And that is what God promises will break on the horizon. Because if we're here, and then there's all this stuff that lies before us, it could quite possibly be impossible for us to get to the other side, to penetrate without God's protection. But what God does is God comes from this already blooming place, from this place of already goodness, of already love, of already joy, and uses that as the weapon that he cuts back on the path. So in some very real ways, what God does is cut where there's no path, cuts the path back to us, so that when we have to travel that way, the path has been cut. We still have to go, but God already knows the path. The promise is that in the wilderness we may not know the way, and we may be blind, and we may be deaf. But God's been through the wasteland and knows the way. The promise is that God's holy highway will in some way intersect all these roads that we pave. And it's not that God's going to just intersect and get us through. Like, that's not the way of God. It's not to just get through. It's to bring in this everlasting joy. To crown us with joy. What Isaiah says is that everlasting joy shall be upon your head. That you will wear that. And that is something that no one can take away. I think what's often hard for us is that sometimes being able to know joy or recognize joy often comes about in us having known pain. It's not really an easy reality to face, but it's often true that hope springs forth from suffering. But we can have confidence. We can have confidence that this is true because since the beginning of time, God's been coming to the world in this ways that we could never dream about, through means that we would never think of. Like a maiden's womb, like a tiny baby, like a cross. So here's sort of my Advent wish for you. Because some of our roads are smooth and quick. And if you are on a smooth and quick road right now, then I pray that you will be able to see and hear the joys that are along that road, that you don't pass them by too fast. And if the road that you're on right now is a slow and bumpy road, may you know this Advent season that that is not all there is. May you know that the horizon is already calling you out of the desert. That there's more wasteland behind you today than there was yesterday. That the way of the Spirit is sometimes to just keep on walking. So if you hear anything today, let it be that there is no place, not even the darkest crevices of our hearts, that